Red put down his knife and fork and joined his wife at the window, pushing aside the muslin curtains and leaning across the girl's big sewing machine. There certainly was an unusual stir abroad and startling shouts and cries upon the wind. And yet Red could see the 3 yellow crocuses and the 2 purple crocuses in their patch of garden that had been there yesterday in the green paint that he had put on their little gate in the afternoon. "I'd give £10 for this 'ere bloomin' flood to let the boogers bloody bridge and soak the clay till the boogers bleedin' now road falls in. But it'll be poor men what'll suffer, girlie. Not rich ones like him, if there is water rise up and hover." Yeah, sorry about that, but the way it's written, it requires a accent of some kind, and that's the one I've picked. Sally put her plump arm affectionately round his neck. "You never loved Miss Crummy like you love me, did you, Red?" she whispered coaxingly. "Garn!" cried Red. They were both silent then, Sally thinking to herself, "Shall I ever dare to ask him about Jenny Morgan? And what should I do if Jenny Morgan came to see Mother?" And Red thinking to himself, "I wouldn't care a wriggle what's happened to this bastard commune as long as the booger got it in his bleeding neck." This passive trance of Red and Sally at their window was interrupted by the inrush through Red's green gate of a couple of excited neighbors. "Jenny Morgan be drowned in flood," they cried, "and little Nellie be clinging, fit to perish, to her mother's corpsey." Wow. Another character dying. Sally Robinson turned quickly to her husband. "We must go down there, Red," she said. Red sighed heavily, but he did not gainsay her words. Long before the flood had reached the point at which Red and Sally were called upon to confront it, the mayor of Glastonbury was making his way dry-shod to his morning lecture at Chalice Hill. Before his wife and Crummy were out of bed, and before any sign of the incoming water had reached the end of Street Road, Bloody Johnny was hurrying in blind excitement, with his head bent and his hands clasped behind his back, to his beloved rotunda. His own words for all the buildings on Chalice Hill was simply Town's End, an old Montacute name which helped to make him feel at home there. Excuse me. "I'm off to Town's End, my precious," he would say to Mrs. Geard, or, "I'll be back from Town's End, my sweet, my tea time today, never fear." By tea time today. He wasn't calling his wife tea time. On this historical morning, the mayor's head was so full of a new inspiration which he had received, or dreamed he had received, from his master that night, that he had not even paused in his kitchen to make himself a cup of tea before setting out. It would be a mistake to assume, as some afterwards did, that Bloody Johnny was oblivious to the perils of the water that just then threatened Glastonbury. The man was like some desperate medieval artist, some frantically inspired craftsman who, even though the enemy is at the gates of his city, must, by an urge that endures no withstanding, complete his unfinished statue, his picture, his fresco, his molten cast. To enter into the real heart of what he had been feeling during the last 48 hours, it would be necessary to remember that the man had for weeks, nay, for a couple of months, dropped all active connection with the administration of that tiny dictatorship of which he was the technical head. What he felt in his mind now was only an intensified awareness of what he had been vaguely feeling ever since that momentous opening of his Saxon arch. "The Lord's going to let me take my life," he kept saying to himself, "and I must finish my work before I go." What he thought of as his work was the rounding off and completion of his 5th Gospel, delivered to all and sundry at Town's End. Had the flood been accompanied by a fire, had the flood and the fire been accompanied by a murderous uprising of the mob, and then again by signs and portents, by thundering and lightnings, in air and sky, Bloody Johnny would still have hurried off to his heathen academia. He had hardly slept at all that night, and now, quite heedless of the rumors of the broken dams, heedless of the overcrowded state of the threatened town, heedless of any danger that might be threatening his wife and menacing his daughters, thinking always in his heart, "My end is near, and I must finish my work before I go," Mr. Gurd arrived at Chelles Hill. He found himself, before he knew what he was doing, helplessly fumbling at the closed door of Mrs. Jones's tea-booth, which stood not far from the section arch. Mrs. Jones, however, like most of the Glastonbury people, was far from sharing the mayor's indifference to the overwhelming catastrophe that was imminent that fatal day. It began to look as if Bloody Johnny's craving for tea, which his sleepless and rather feverish night had rendered extreme, was not destined to be satisfied. By good luck, however, young Elphin Cantle and his friend Steve Lou had slept together that night in Solly's loft, above the St. Michael's garage. Matt Decker had shaken his head off late, very gravely, over what he called that young degenerate seduction of such a wholesome lad. But without avail. Elphin was a more slippery customer than Tommy Chinook. Young Cantle, at the moment, had the key to his father's little booth, among his assemblage of acquisitive wooden shanties, and the two boys had already got their kettle boiling in the little shelter, and were just beginning to enjoy their bread and jam, when they heard the mayor thumping at the door of Mrs. Jones' ramshackle storehouse. Elphin peeped out. "It's Master Gurd," he whispered excitedly to his friend. "And he be all white and shivery. He've a heard summat. He's a heard the girt flood. He be come to tell Mother Jones she bet climb up tor top wi' he." Steve Lou stood up with wide-open eyes. His mouth was full of bread and jam, but he was too agitated to masticate or even to swallow. The wild and extravagant thought rushed through his head that perhaps Mr. Garrett would condescend to share their amateur repast. "It would be fine, Elf, wouldn't it?" he blurted out, "if Mayor drank a cup of tea along with 'ee?" Elphin sighed. He had anticipated the pleasure of uninterrupted colloquy with his young friend when he had strengthened his heart with raspberry jam. He wished the mayor of Glastonbury at the devil. Why was fate always snatching the few hours of romance which he had in life away from him? It had been like this when he was with Mr. Sam. Someone was always interrupting. Elphin stood hesitating in the doorway now, one agitated eye upon the obese, bareheaded man who was now muttering to himself and gazing helplessly around, and one upon his shuddering and excited friend. Stuttering, not shuddering. But the mayor of Glastonbury had caught sight of him. "Do you know what a man could get a cup of tea, me boy?" he inquired humbly, almost in the tone of a thirsty tramp. Elphin scowled savagely, but his sense of honor compelled him to report the great man's request to the boy in the hut. "He be asking for someone hot," he whispered. Steve swallowed his mouthful so hurriedly that it almost choked him, and rushed to the door. "Please come in here, sir," he cried, pushing his friend unceremoniously out of the way. "Me and Elf be having a bite, us be, and us 'ud be proud to give him all." Bloody Johnny responded to this invitation with alacrity, and his gratitude and good temper, when he had eaten and drunk, were so winning that even the jealous heart of Elphin Cantle was beguiled. Sounds of such lively merriment soon began to emerge from the Cantle beer shop, that the little crowd of early visitors, who had already assembled in front of the Saxon Arch, got the impression that the master, rumor soon told them where he was, had been drinking all night in that shanty. This story, that on the morning of the 15th, the day above all others, when the man's wits should have been clearest, he was found hopelessly drunk, in company with two degenerate slum boys, spread all over Somerset before the end of the week, and was mixed up in the most hopeless manner with the official accounts of the Glastonbury flood. But Bloody Johnny thanked his young entertainers with a pure heart and a clear head and made his way into the rotunda. He paused for a moment, however, to speak with young Toosey, whose cadaverous grin above his neat corduroy suit suggested a death's head in the attire of an operatic forester. "Mother Ledge had her breakfast upstairs and her bited upstairs," the old man reported. It was astonishing how full of people the rotunda was when Bloody Johnny finally pushed his way to his uncomfortable throne and took up his mystical discourse where he had left it the day before. It was a relief to him on the occasion, when he was obsessed by the idea that he had had a special revelation, to notice that there were a couple of young men from his own Wayfarer in the corner of the rotunda, armed with the most professional-looking notebooks. "He knows his business," he thought, that Middlezoy lad. "I'd never have supposed he'd send him to Town's End when flood be rising." Slowly he let his formidable black eyes glance over his audience. There seemed to be a predominance of Welsh people there this morning, judging from the rising inflection of the excited murmurs that he caught from many parts of the crowded circle. "I expect, being mountaineers, they know nothing of floods," he thought. "I hope they'll all get safe home." And then he became aware of young Toosey standing at his elbow. "Flood be rushing down High Street, your worship. Town council be meeting in church so as to be near Tower in case of accidents. Town crier have been sent around to tell the foreigners to take it to the hills, and they've commended every boat there be on river, and Mr. Trent and Mr. Spear and Mr. Decker and the fire brigade men and the Boy Scout lads be taking folk from their osied windies and carrying off they to the foot of Wirral. Old Bob Shepherd be waiting outside, your worship, for to take thee to where town council be." "Tell Shepherd not to wait for me, Toosey," whispered the mayor. "Tell him to tell them I'll come later, when I've finished what I've got to do here. Tell them to telegraph for boats to Taunton and Bridgewater and every town with the river, and do it quickly before the wires are down. Tell them to telephone to Bristol and the wires aren't down, and make 'em send a dozen airplanes with breads and wines and milk straight to Wirral Hill. And tell 'em that they can make a landing before those trees up there, though it's difficult. It's rather difficult. But I know it's possible. Tell 'em before, because I've seen poor Barter do it when he piloted Crow." He paused for a moment while the whispering in the audience rose to an agitated pitch. "Are the trains running still, Toosey?" he inquired. "They wasn't when I left 'em, your worship, and their here waters be mounting up hour by hour. No trains'll leave Glaston today, your worship. If I were the council myself, I'd send town crier round to say that all foreigners what has cars of any kind leave this town at onst, on pain of being shot." The mayor chuckled at this, and the audience looked at each other and smiled. They were evidently thinking to themselves, "He must have heard that the floods are going down, or they couldn't take things so easy." Young Toosey went off to convey his message, or what he could remember of his message, to Bob Shepherd. Well, if that's not some foreshadowing, I don't know what is, huh? It's not going to go too well for our mayor, I'm afraid. Or I guess he'll be satisfied with the results, but it'll be a little chilling, I'm sure. Kind of reminds me of certain events, certain big crowds, certain pandemics, certain other things that happen that shouldn't be happening now, eh? Anyway, till next time, I'll see you in Glastonbury. Bye-bye.